So let's see. We are on page Yud Amud Base 10b, and we were learning about the sukkah that is has some type of a interruption, some type of an oyel inside the sukkah, kinoifos, like a canopy, naklitin, some type of a like a also a canopy, but without any like roof, more like a triangle canopy. Then we had Hila, which was similar to a canopy, but it was less permanent. And and we had this statement of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that you're allowed to even dwell in such a sukkah, and as long as it's not 10 handbreadths tall from the bed. That would be considered batel, sort of like nullified to the schach, and it's not considered like it's not considered its own schach. It's really considered nullified. Gemara went through a number of questions on that. So the point here is, I should emphasize that we're not hassling the sukkah. We're not saying the sukkah is invalid. But what we are saying is you can't dwell in this area of the sukkah, because in this part of the sukkah, there is some type of a canopy that's above you. And in the scenario we're talking about now, Shmuel says that if it's above 10 handbreadths, that is a problem. Like you can't sleep in this sukkah, in this area of the sukkah. But the sukkah itself would be kosher. Now, if it doesn't have 10 handbreadths, then it's not a problem because it's not called an oyel. You're not considered to be in a separate oyel. You're inside your sukkah. You're in the sail of the sukkah. You're in the shade of the sukkah. Otherwise, if it's more than 10 tfachim, it has a roof. This is a problem. You're not really dwelling in the sail of a sukkah. You're inside an oyel. Now, if you stand outside this canopy, then fine, then you're okay. You're in the sukkah. Yes, Victor, do you have a question? Oh, your hand was it looked like okay. Now the Gemara asked a few questions on this. We brought a brisa. Again, we're on 10b for those that want to follow along with my review. So I'm just saying it outside. But basically, the Gemara had a question from a brisa that it says you are not yotze if you're sleeping in a kila. The kila, again, is this canopy that's somewhat temporary canopy, relatively temporary. So this contradicts Shmuel. Shmuel had said that it's that a kila, if it's over 10 handbreadths, it's prohibited. The brisa doesn't clarify if it's 10 handbreadths or not. And it says you're not yotze. So the Gemara's question really is that it sounds from the brisa that even if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it's usher, it's prohibited. You're not yotze the mitzvah of sukkah because you're dwelling in a tent. You're not dwelling in a sukkah. And that contradicts Shmuel that said that in a kila is no problem as long as it's not 10 handbreadths. The Gemara answers that we have to explain the brisa, even though the brisa didn't specify, but we're going to explain that the brisa is talking about a case that it is 10 handbreadths tall, and then it fits with Shmuel. Shmuel said his law when it's not 10 handbreadths, it's permissible to sit and to sleep inside that kila. But the brisa said in general you're not allowed to. The Gemara explains it means when it's above 10 handbreadths, and that's the way Shmuel actually qualified his statement. So it fits. Then the Gemara asked from the Mishnah. There's a Mishnah that says that a person who sleeps under a bed in the sukkah is not yotze. I should mention that, most of us are not familiar with the complications of sleeping in a sukkah. At least In
No.
America, a lot of people don't sleep in
So,
the.
so actually, my boys used to in New England. It's doable.
It's
But my
doable.
question is actually, sounds like, let's say in here it can actually get chilly. I mean, so and if you're in a sleeping bag,
Right.
is this covered by what we're discussing here? Like a person in a sleeping bag, he's all bundled up and
Right.
yeah, it's chilly out there. Is he sleeping in the
He's
sukkah?
sleeping in a sukkah. That's not a problem. It's not a problem. But it's a good question because you see, right, you start questioning it when you start seeing these different scenarios that it could be that you're not in a sukkah, you're inside, you're inside a tent. But a sleeping bag shouldn't be a problem. But here we have people sleeping under a bed. And what I wanted to mention was that um, there's a big issue that people have when they do sleep in the sukkah is how do you have room for your whole for all the men of the family? At least the men are obligated to sleep in a sukkah. So it creates a big problem. In fact, I remember in yeshiva where people used to talk about a question: are you allowed once someone is sleeping? Are you allowed to carry them out of the sukkah? And do they no longer fulfill the mitzvah? Or is it okay because they're sleeping, they're exempt now from the mitzvah, and now let someone else go to sleep in the sukkah? So in other words, people have an issue where, there's not enough space in the sukkahs, where how are you going to all sleep in the sukkah? So this is an issue, and that's why here they seem to have this answer. They wanted to at least have someone sleep under the bed. So, in other words, I'm just giving you an example why someone would even think of sleeping under the bed is because they simply had problems of having enough space to sleep in the sukkah, and uh, and I must say that the halacha is that you're really supposed to sleep in a sukkah. We follow leniencies not to sleep in a sukkah. That it's either cold or it's uncomfortable, and there's also a Hasidic understanding that it's if the Rebbe doesn't sleep in the sukkah, it's uncomfortable for a chassid of his not to, so you're sort of mitztaer. You're in pain to sleep in a sukkah if your Rebbe doesn't sleep, so there's different leniencies of not sleeping in a sukkah that I would think most Americans are relying on. Of course, there are definitely people here in America that do sleep in the sukkah, but in general, the common rule is that people are lenient and especially in Lubavitch is known to be very lenient about sleeping in the sukkah because it's known that the Rebbe didn't. Yeah, the Rebbe didn't go to sleep on Sukkot. That's the only thing. So the Rebbe didn't sleep in a sukkah, but he also didn't sleep outside. Didn't really sleep outside the sukkah. But in any event, the Rebbe had a whole sikha about sleeping, about the thing that the Rebbeim in Russia they risked their lives for mitzvahs. Why didn't they sleep in a sukkah? You would think they risked their lives for every little thing. In fact, to the extent that they wouldn't drink a drop of water outside the sukkah. But when it came to sleeping, how is it possible that they didn't sleep in the sukkah? So it was like a surprising thing. Even though according to halach, of course, there's leniencies about not sleeping in a sukkah. But the question was about the Rebbeim. The Rebbe had a whole discussion about it. But anyway, according to halacha, according to the letter of the law, we're all supposed to be sleeping in the sukkah, and the question is how you do that if you have a big family. And even though the women are exempt, but the men should all be obligated to sleep in a sukkah. So here, the Brisa show tells us that they tried this way of sleeping under the bed, but the Brisa tells us that you're not yoitza. Yeah, yes. Someone had a question over here. David, yes.
Yeah, what's the idea of sleeping under the bed? Like I like that. It's like you have a mattress and you go under the mattress.
So that's what I'm saying, that they didn't have enough space. So if you have one person under the bed, one person on the bed, you kill two birds with one stone. You know what I mean? You got the same space. You got two people,
you're
and if
laying down, and on top of you there's a mattress and another person sleeping on top of
Oh,
you.
on top
no.
of the bed, on top of the bed posts and the bed board, there's a person on top of you. So you're under
Like
the
they,
bed. Then you have one person on top of you, and I would think that there could
ah,
be a bunk bed as well,
like
maybe two people on top of you. But that would be another question. Would a bunk bed be okay in a sukkah? But the point is that you're limited with space. How do you fit the whole family sleeping? Eating in a sukkah is not a big deal, but how do you sleep in a sukkah with the whole family? It's not a simple thing.
I'm not picturing the idea of sleeping under a bed. I don't
Picture picture a bunk bed. You know what a bunk bed looks like?
right,
So how many people can sleep on a bunk bed? Two, right?
right.
What about if you yourself lie down under the bunk bed? How many people are there now? Three.
Yeah, three, right?
So that's where the mattress is supported. So
No,
it's
forget
not on
about no
top of you.
mattress. Supported by, right. The top mattress is supported by some board, and that's on top of you, but it's not touching you. And you are sleeping under it. You have a free space where no one's going to step on you. It's under the mat,
So
under the bed.
so when they're saying sleeping under the bed, you're not actually sleeping under a mattress. You don't have a mattress laying on your body.
No, correct, correct.
Oh, okay.
So that's the thing. So as I was mentioning, I remember in yeshiva they had a question if you're allowed to carry someone outside of a sukkah after they're sleeping, and maybe they're now exempt, and then you could fit another person, could take their space. So you let people fall asleep in the sukkah, you carry them out, and then you could go in their bed. The problem with that whole idea is that generally when you carry someone out, they wake up. So then they'd be again obligated to go sleep in the sukkah. So it's not like the perfect answer to it, even if it would be acceptable. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, I had heard that some gods, although it might have been Moshe Feinstein, stopped sleeping in the sukkah when New York State eliminated the death penalty.
Uh-huh. That's a very interesting. That's
I
an
couldn't
interesting
hear.
thing.
I couldn't hear what he said.
He said that Reb Moshe Feinstein stopped sleeping in the sukkah when the New York State eliminated the death penalty, I guess for murder or whatever. So in other words, he felt it was unsafe at that point, and therefore you don't have to sleep in the sukkah. That's a very interesting thing. I'd have to look into that. I'm sure if you look up online, you could see if that's if it's a rumor or it's true, but it is interesting. Okay.
I mean, I heard that a yeshiva that I go to in Flatbush on Sunday morning. So, I mean, I had heard it there.
Right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it sounds interesting. So I understand the logic. I'm just you have to look into it and just make sure it's a true rumor. Okay. So the Brisa here talks about sleeping under the bed, and it says you're not yoitza, and it sounds like even if the bed is less than 10 tfachim, and why are you not fulfilling the obligation of sukkah if the bed is lower than 10 handbreadths? So the Gemara answers that it's talking about that it's above 10 handbreadths. So even though the simple reading of it would make it sound as a simple practical case, you would think it's probably less than 10 handbreadths, but the Gemara says that Shmuel had already explained that brisa to mean that it's mita gavoya asara tvachim. There's a space from the bed to the ground of 10 handbreadths, and therefore, if a person slept under it, it would not be considered that he's sleeping in a sukkah, but rather he's sleeping inside a tent. Again, all of these cases are not possible in the sukkah. They are invalidating the place where you're sleeping, but the sukkah itself remains kosher. Just happens to be in the sukkah, there happens to be a tent that you might, if you sit under it, you will not be considered sitting in the sukkah or sleeping in the sukkah or lying in the sukkah and so on. Now comes the Gemara brought another proof, and that was from our Mishnah. And our Mishnah says that if you spread out a sheet on top of the kinoifais, which is the four poles, and it's puzzle. The Mishnah said it's invalid, and the reason is because it's considered a tent. At least the simple understanding, according to Rashi, was that it's a tent, and you're dwelling inside a tent, and if you're dwelling in a tent, you know, you're not dwelling in the sukkah. Now that would, if that's so, that kinaifos is a problem. So how could Shmuel say that you could sleep inside a kila? So the Gemara wanted to say that it's very simple, a big difference. The kila is less than 10 handbreadths, and the Mishnah that we quoted is more than 10 handbreadths. It's Gavi Asara. And the Gemara said that you can't answer that. Why can't you answer that? You can't answer that because there's a brisa that spells it out a little more, and it talks about naklitin versus kinaifos, just like the Mishnah did. The Mishnah talked about the naklitin, which are the two poles type of triangular canopy. I don't know if you'd call that a canopy, but yes, can you call it a triangle type of thing a canopy? Yes, so. Okay, so the triangular canopy, and then the naklitin, and then the kinaifos, and it talks about both of those cases in the brisa, and it mentions that the kinaifos is pasul, naklitin is kosher, just like the Mishnah, and it adds as long as the naklitin are kosher, as long as they're not 10 handbreadths from the ground. So that means that the kinaifos that are not kosher, that are invalid to sleep inside this area, that's the kinaifos. It's also talking about the same case, and yet that case, which is less than 10 handbreadths, for a kinaifos is going to be invalid, and for naklitin it's going to be valid. Which means for the canopy that has a 4-pole canopy, which we'll call it a square or a rectangular canopy, that canopy is going to invalidate this, even though it's less than 10 handbreadths. So how is that going to fit with Shmuel's law that that we said in the name of Shmuel that you're allowed to sleep in a kila that's less than 10 handbreadths, but we have clear that you're not allowed to sleep in kinaifos that's less than 10 handbreadths. That seems to be a clear contradiction. The Gemara's answer is kinaifos is different than kila because kinaifos are kaviyah. They are more attached. It's more stronger. And because it's stronger, that's a problem. It's considered you're dwelling in a separate entity. However, kila, being that it's not so strongly attached, if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it's not considered kavua, it's not considered permanent, it's not considered an entity of its own. You're not dwelling in a separate entity. You are dwelling inside a sukkah when it comes to kila, but when it comes to kinaifos, you're not dwelling inside a sukkah. Exactly how strong it's talking about, the Gemara doesn't tell us exactly how this worked. I guess in the time of the Gemara, they knew what the difference between kinaifos and kila is. Yeah. And we don't really do things like this, so I guess and the Gemara therefore didn't explain it because in that time maybe they had clarity what kinaifos and what kila is. Yes, Jeffrey.
I'm pretty sure we know. We have even now. You'll see 4-poster beds. They're called 4-poster beds, and the posts are part of the wood of the bed. It's one piece on each side, so it's permanent posts.
So okay. I think, let me just cut you off for a second. I think we're talking about I'm not 100% sure, but I think we're talking about that the canopy above it is strong.
Yes,
the way you're explaining it is the poles are much more strongly connected. Let me just look at Rashi for a second. You might be right, but it's a little unclear. I can't say that the Gemara spells out, if it means the poles are very strong, or does it mean that the material on top is very strong?
Well, we had this all through the 19th century, and And you know, we had examples of Helenia Malka, and we had examples of rabbis who was sleeping in. Those people brought their furniture from the house into the sukkah.
Okay.
Okay, and in the house they had a four-posted bed, and it had a drapery around it. You could like pull the drapery around the bed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and they were considered to be very valuable in the 17th century in England. You would be listed in your for your heirs who got that bed. So people who are more like royalty, aristocrats, they had such a bed, and sometimes the canopy is part. It's actually nailed in. It's not a removable canopy. It's part of the posts. So I'm pretty sure we know what that is. I'm pretty sure we know that. But with naklitin, it's something different. It's something like you could put a certain kind of vice, or a bracket on the front of the back of the bed, the headboard and the front footboard, and you could put a bracket on so that it would hold up the sheet that would be like a tent, but it would be thrift. It's a leaning. But that would be something where you could have put a bracket on the front of the back of the bed to put up the post. It's not permanent, not part of the bed.
So what you're saying is the concept of having some type of a canopy over the bed was common, or maybe is still common in certain places, or amongst the aristocrats. But
sure.
The question is, were there two types, or was it what? Do we know of only one type? Was there the kila and the kinaifis?
Yes.
Are we familiar with two types?
Yes. There's a certain kind of bed. You can see if you go to London, you can see in the British Museum, you can see a lot of these kinds of things because they have personal effects of people from that 17th century. Okay, so some families they never got rid of their stuff, right? So there's a certain kind of bed where you sleep. It's all beautiful wood, and it has a footboard, but the footboard has no posts. But the headboard has a piece coming out over the first part of the bed. Not going to go over the whole bed, but just over the front, the head part of the bed. Okay?
That's interesting. Okay.
So there are actually these things that really existed. Now, whether the ancient world, we're talking in Babylonia in the 5th century, whether that was the same, I can't be sure about that, but I know certainly later on, it seems to me it's the same kind of thing.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm just going to look in the back over here. I'm just wondering if this, if the canopy, are we explaining that the poles are more attached, or are we explaining that the canopy is more attached? I'm just going to look here for a second to see if they mention it. The Gemara just says Kaviying.
Rabbi.
Yes, Ezra.
In a four-poster bed, the canopy that's on top basically forms a second roof.
Okay.
And that could be problematic when you're talking about sleeping in a sukkah.
Okay.
Whereas,
for sure.
Whereas in the other case, because I guess the sheet, if anything, comes down on an angle, or even if it's just a net to keep mosquitoes and things out, it's not perceived as a roof as it is in the four-corner bed.
Right. Correct. The thing is, we're talking about two cases. Both have 4 poles, and one is going to be okay, one isn't. That's where we're getting into a problem here, where one was called Kila, one was called Kinaifis. Now you're comparing Kinaifis to Naklitin, but the Gemara here is comparing Kinaifis to Kila. It also compared, as you did, Kinaifis to Naklitin. It compared that in the Brisa. But the Gemara's issue in contradiction is the Kila law versus the Kinaifis law. And that's where we're trying to answer it, that the Kinaifis are more kaviyi than the kila, and the kila is also a four-poled canopy.
It doesn't say that specifically, though, here in the Gemara.
No, I'm talking.
Okay,
about-
okay, but that's the way
reason
the
why I even
commentaries
brought it-
understand it.
The only reason why I brought it up was because the kinofot, the sheet that's on top, that's being supported by the four posters,
Yeah,
actually is producing a roof.
yeah, for sure. But kila is the same thing. Kila is the same thing. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel mutter lishan bakila. So this whole Gemara is based on that statement of Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and it's like right in the middle of the page on page 10b.
Is it? I thought, Rabbi, what you were saying before is it's more of the what's on top, because when you have the four posts, you have a much bigger covering as opposed to just the two posts with
Right,
like a
sure.
and it sounds like that the issue with the Gemara is not the post, it's how big this thing that's over the bed is. If it's like a 4x8 size, then that's the problem. It sounds like is what the
So
Yeah,
where is
but
the
Rab-
cutoff? Where is the cutoff?
But Rabbi, it says Tashma Hayashen Bekila Basuka Lo Yetzech Yedecha Oto.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me show you what I'm referring to, Ezra. Ezra, if you look in Rashi, Rashi says kila. Do you see kila in Rashi? It's in the middle of the page of Rashi, in the middle of Rashi. Kila, it says haprusa svivais hamita. A kila is spread out around the bed.
Right.
Okay. And then he says, V'afal pi sheyesh lo gad, even though it has a roof, she'ein gaga b'shupa keshel naklitin. The kila roof is not slanted like naklitin, ela shava keshel kinaifais. It's equal like kinaifais. So the kinaifais roof and the kila roof are basically the same.
This is not the picture that David showed us yesterday. We showed us picture at the very end.
So he showed us a picture of
Naklitin.
kinaifais and naklitin.
Okay.
Now, the truth of the matter is, I don't know how much different kila is from the kinaifais. Is it something that you don't visibly see so clearly? In other words, one is more attached than the other? Or is it very clear that one is called a kila, one is called kinaifais? You know what I mean? They might be very similar, or there might be a major difference. The Gemara seems to think that they're the same, and then the Gemara answers, no, one is more kvi. So it implies like maybe they aren't that different, but it happens to be that element of kvius is a little more by one of them, and therefore it's considered that it changes the halacha based on that. All right. So anyway, and the bottom line is here, in the back over here. Let's see. They don't seem to.
Maybe Rabbi, maybe in the Kila, even though it does have sort of a roof, maybe that roof is much smaller than that of the kinofot.
Similar to what Jeffrey was saying, that maybe it only goes over the front part.
No, because I mean, I can visualize something that is being held by four posts, maybe not exactly in the same way that that you have in a four-poster bed, where the four posts are at the corners of the bed, but this is at other locations. And it may form a smaller rectangular area above the bed, and then the sheets come down, because it says it has to go all the way around the bed, so it has to come down and basically come to the edges of the bed.
Right. It sounds like maybe you're saying there's more material in the kila than the kinaifos. Is that how you're understanding it? That maybe it's around. I mean, Rashi says that it's surrounding the bed, meaning it's not only on top, it's all around it. Now in the Mishnah, when we said kinaifos, let's see how Rashi translated kinaif. The other condition, Yeah, he doesn't mention about how they're spreading around on they're covering the bottom. In other words, is that what you're saying, Ezra? That the
Well,
kinoifes
in
maybe
the
aren't going all the
foot,
way down.
in a kino foot, I think if there is any material, it just goes straight down. It's not at an angle, it just goes straight down. And just, you may have four sides to the material that goes from one poster to the next. And then on top of the four posters is another piece of material that basically covers it. Just like the picture that David had shown yesterday. But I'm saying in the not Kila. In the Kila, it must be it must be a smaller roof, if you want to call it that. But you do have the material that comes down to the edges of the bed. So it doesn't have as big a roof as the foot. And maybe that's the reason why they're saying that one in comparison to the other is okay, because the roof area is much smaller, or
Not efficient.
than the kino foot, and so therefore that's the reason why I say it's okay.
Right. So the Gemara used the word that the kila is okay because it's not kavi'i. So I guess what you mean to say as a way of explaining that,
Which could mean the following, let's say you have four strings that come from the roof and connect the four corners of the top material. And so therefore it is not kavua, it's not fixed per se, because the entire thing can actually move. And then from that, the material goes down to the edges of the bed. That's, I mean, I'm trying to view this in my mind's eye.
right.
If
But
there
I'm
are,
just trying to figure out, why do you think that the kila is a smaller roof than the kinoif? Why? How do you see that? Where do you see that from?
I mean, that's the only way that I can understand why, because if the roof material is big enough, then it would, for all intents and purpose, block you, or you may be blocked from seeing the schach. It may be underneath and cover, and maybe 80% of the schach. With a kino foot, whereas with a kila it might be 20%, 30%, something like that.
In other words, you're bothered with the fact that one will be kosher and yet you're not seeing the schach. How could the kila be kosher if you're not seeing the schach? Is that more or less what you're saying? So it's
you can replace the sheet that's there with a netting. You'd still be able to see the schach. And it would still produce sort of a much smaller rectangular area. And then from that rectangular area, you have the rest of the netting, or the sheet that comes down and to the edges of the bed. I mean, I see it as a way of keeping mosquitoes, things out.
Right. So I didn't want to get into the mosquito thing yet, because the Gemara will talk about a netting for mosquitoes. So I sort of like pushing that off. So so let's like leave that on the side. But anyway, the bottom line over here is that the kila and or whatever else you're doing, putting there, it seems to be some type of a decorative thing, as Jeffrey was saying. It's aristocrats have it. It's a decorative type of a way of beautifying your bedroom and your bed. So being that understanding it that way, the reason why you'd be allowed to sleep in this area is it doesn't seem to have it doesn't seem to be an issue with the fact that you don't see the schach. Like, that's not the problem. Is it because it's see-through material? Maybe, but it doesn't. The Gemara doesn't mention that. I would think that even if it's not see-through, the fact that if it's considered, not an entity of its own, then it's not a tent. It's more, it's a temporary type of a blanket type of thing. It's a temporary type of covering. Then it becomes batel to the sukkah. So are you called, you're dwelling in the sukkah? Yes. What? I don't see the schach. Okay, so you're in bed, you're sleeping. When you're sleeping, you also don't see the schach. Or when your eyes are closed, you don't see the schach. The fact is, I do remember the Gemara that talked about the 3 different opinions about a sukkah that's too tall, and you're supposed to be able to see the schach according to one of them. But the question is that even that opinion, not necessarily does that opinion mean that you have to actually physically or at all times be able to see the schach. The sukkah is a sukkah that you could see the schach. I happen to have a hat that's covering over, and I have dark sunglasses on. At this point, I'm not seeing the schach. That's not going to be a reason why because your sukkah is a sukkah that you can see the schach. The schach is not too high, so I don't think seeing the schach is going to be an issue, even knowing that Gemara on page 2b. You know what I mean? I don't think that's an issue. So I think the only issue we have to deal with is the fact that, is this considered an entity of its own, or is it considered subordinate to the sukkah? And if it's an entity of its own, that's a problem. If it's subordinate to the sukkah, then that's why it's permissible. Now, what the exact case is, the practicality, the physical meaning of the word of this case of kila, how exactly, doesn't say clearly what we don't see clearly what it is, but we do know that it's very similar to the kinaifais, and we do know that the covering seems to go all around. And my guess is that because it's such a large amount of material, it's not going to blow around. So you didn't tie it so tight, and it's maybe something decorative for the moment. The kinoifais sound like that's the way the bed was always. The kila sounds like maybe the bride and groom want to, they're getting married that night. They put this sheet over, make it look really fancy. I'm just throwing an idea that maybe it's something not so permanent. The kinoifais, maybe more the aristocrats. That's how they have their bed for their they're always is something like that. So so maybe it's something like that. The kila that surrounded the bed, and it was on top. It wasn't really tied. So therefore, it's not considered like an entity of its own, and it's more of a subordinate to the sukkah. So are you dwelling in a sukkah? Yeah. Now, if you're in a kila, if you're in a kinaifais, that's another story. I'm not exactly in the sukkah. I'm inside a kinaifais. I'm an aristocrat. I'm in a kinaifais bed. I'm not. I'm not in the sukkah now. So that would be problematic. Now, if you want to learn the other way, that it means the poles are more permanent, you could explain it that way. Maybe that because the poles are so permanently attached, it causes that even the schach on top, even the sheet on top, carries with it that element of like being an entity of its own. But if even the poles, the posts are not so sturdy, and so it's more of a temporary thing. So you could explain it that way. I just wanted to know what the commentaries say anything here to make it very clear, and I don't see any hint or discussion about it. So either way, however you learn, it seems to be that's the emphasis here, is if it's subordinate to the sukkah, or is it an entity of its own. Okay, now the Gemara, this is where we're up to, if I'm not mistaken, Vaharei. We're up to the word Vaharei. We're going to do this inside now. Vaharei is on page 10b, the first word on the line. It's about maybe 12 lines up from the bottom. Vaharei sukkah al gabe sukkah dikvia. Now, a sukkah on top of a sukkah that we learned before Let me just put the air conditioning on. Okay. So Sukkah Gabe Sukkah, the Gemara says. We learned in the Mishnah that if you have a sukkah on top of a sukkah, the kviya, that the top sukkah is kavua. It's a permanent type of entity. V'yamar Shmuel kehechshera kach psula. And Shmuel said that the same measurement that's needed for koshering a sukkah, the same measurement will be needed to invalidate the sukkah below. That the top sukkah is called a sukkah, it needs to have that same measurement of 10 handbreadths. So what comes out from that Mishnah is that in order to invalidate your dwelling, you need to have a measurement of 10 handbreadths. And we are saying over here that kinaifais are invalid even if it's less than 10 handbreadths. So it doesn't seem to fit with Shmuel's other law. We have another law from Shmuel that says that a real sukkah, something kvius, which invalidates a sukkah, is only when it's 10 handbreadths. And here, what did we want to explain? That how do we explain Shmuel when he says a kila, you can sleep inside the kila, under the kila? And we explained that, yeah, kila, it's less than 10 handbreadths. You're allowed to sleep in it because it's not kviya, it's not so permanent. But kinaifa is less than 10 handbreadths. You because it's more permanent, even though it's less than 10 handbreadths, you would not be allowed to sleep in. But this seems to be contradicted by the other point of Shmuel, that Shmuel holds that a sukkah, gabe sukkah, is only invalidated if it's 10 full handbreadths. So how are we going to fit these again? So we have 3 laws now. One law is about the 10 handbreadths, sukkah tachas sukkah, that it has to be a sukkah, top sukkah has to have a full 10 handbreadths to make the bottom sukkah invalid. Another law we have that a kila that's less than 10 handbreadths, because it's not permanent, it's kosher, you could dwell inside the kila, inside the sukkah. And the other law that a kinaivais, you cannot dwell inside the kinaivais even though it's less than 10 handbreadths, because it's kvi. So these 2 laws don't seem to fit. Kinaifais because it's kvi versus sukkah, tachas sukkah, or sukkah al gabe sukkah, the same thing. That it's has a kvi, but it's only if it's 10 handbreadths. So Amri, they say they explained it. In other words, the Bnei Yeshiva explained that you could differentiate hasam by a sukkah under a sukkah, dilamifsal sukkah. What you're doing is invalidating the sukkah. To invalidate a sukkah, ba'asara, it's invalidated only if there's a 10 handbreadth measurement in order to invalidate the sukkah below. So it's there is a sukkah above, it's kavua, and something that's kavua, we said that maybe you don't need 10 handbreadths. So our answer that the Gemara is giving is, yeah, it's kavua, but you're invalidating a sukkah. To invalidate a sukkah, you will need 10 handbreadths to invalidate sukkah. Hacha, here, we're not invalidating the whole sukkah. Here, we're just saying you can't dwell inside this area. You can dwell inside the kinaifas. We're making it into a tent in order to prohibit you from lying under this canopy. So we're not invalidating the sukkah. We're just saying you can't be in this specific area of the sukkah in order to fulfill, if you want to fulfill the mitzvah. So l'shvuye ayala, to make it into considered an ayal, a tent, batzir mea batzir mea sara, Nami Havioil, even less than 10, it'll be an oil as long as it's something kavua. If it's more strong, it's attached strongly to the bed, and therefore it will be considered even less than 10 handbreadths. It'll be considered an oihel, and you will not be allowed to dwell inside it. So that's how the Gemara is answering these basically three. We could actually consider it 4 cases if we want. And we could talk about the naklitin. So now we have 4 cases that we've discussed. We have the kila case, which is not permanent. So it's going to invalidate where you're sleeping, but it's not invalidating the sukkah. That has a law. It depends if it's 10 handbreadths or not. We have the law of the kinoif, the canopy. That law is that it doesn't matter if it's 10 handbreadths or not. That is, you cannot sleep inside that area because that area it's kaviyi, it's kavua, it's an oil, and you're not going to invalidate the sukkah, but you'll invalidate where you're sleep. That area of it will be non-kosher to sleep in. And then we have the law of a sukkah tachas a sukkah, that is invalidating the sukkah. That needs to have 10 handbreadths for the top sukkah in order to invalidate the bottom sukkah. And then if you want to add the 4th case, you have the naklitin case, which was a case where you don't even have an oihel because there's no flat roof. It's only a slanted roof. And in that case, we had the Mishnah and the Brisa said that at least if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it will be kosher to sleep under. So the kinoifais is even less than 10 handbreadths was a problem, but the naklitin were not a problem as long as it's less than 10 handbreadths. It was okay. And I mentioned yesterday that this naklitin law, that it's less than 10 handbreadths. What do you mean? It doesn't have a roof. It doesn't have a flat roof. Why should that be a problem? It's not even called an oihel according to halacha, according to Torah. It's not called a tent. A tent has to have an area of a tevat. So we explained yesterday that Tues talks about it, and he mentions that it's only midrabanan, maker hadin, from the letter of the law. You would be allowed to sleep under such a thing, even if it's more than 10 handbreadths, but doesn't have a roof. It doesn't have a flat roof. Nevertheless, the Chachamim made sort of like a decree. They were machmir. Now, if it's above 10 handbreadths, it's a problem. There is another opinion that argues places. He says that when you have a shipua, you have a slant that could be considered like an oil, and the shipua oilim. There is such an opinion that is brought in the Ramban, but anyway, Tues doesn't follow that. Okay, so the next piece of Gemara. The next piece of Gemara connects really with what we learned maybe 2 years ago, and the laws of the Gemara Brachas about saying Dvarim Shebekdusha, saying things of holiness like Shema when a person is naked. And the Torah says, "V'haya machanecha kadosh, v'layir v'cha'er v'astavar." Person shouldn't see things that are inappropriate. And the Gemara understands davar is dibur, that the dibur of kedusha, when you're speaking words of holiness, or holy words, you can't speak in front of an erva, in front of something, in front of nakedness. So So the Gemara here discusses, because we talked about Kila, the Gemara continues talking about Kila with regard to the laws of Shema. Rav Tachlifa Bar Avimi says in the name Shema, Yeshem B'Kila, a person who's sleeping inside this Kila. Again, this Kila is that it is less than 10 handbreadths. And we just said that that would be okay to sleep in for a sukkah. Now the Gemara says, what about saying you're naked? You're inside the kila, and you're naked. You don't have clothing. You have to understand, in the olden days, people didn't have the same type of closet space and amounts of clothing that we have in today's day and age. And they sometimes would go to sleep naked, pajamas, and clothing ripped or something, So
Maybe they had to wash what they had, and that's all they had.
all they had was one piece of clothing, and they had to wash it. So whatever it is, yeah. Thank you. So anyway, so they slept in this person slept in the kila, and kila, I guess, as we explained, it was pretty much a little somewhat surrounded the bed, so you were secluded. Anyway, so a person was arum, and he wants to now say the Shema. So he sticks his head out, Moitzi Roishai, Michutz L'Kila, V'Keri Kriyashma. Sticks his head outside of the Kila, and he can say Shema. Now, normally that would not work. Why wouldn't that work? As we normally say that we follow the majority of your body. So if the majority of your body is inside this kila, so we normally say your head is where the majority of your body is. And that would mean that you're saying Shema in a place where there's nakedness. And nevertheless, the Gemara says that, no, we can consider this kila, that it's not like a separate entity, and it's like a garment upon you. So what you're doing is sticking your head outside of your garment. So in other words, the Gemara is understanding that a kila, just like we said by sukkah, that it's like subordinate to the sukkah, that you're not really inside a separate entity. This is like the clothing you're wearing almost. Here also regarding Shema, we're not going to say that, oh, you think you're sticking your head out from a window, which the Gemara will soon mention. You think that's so you could say Shema? No, you can't do such a thing. But here, a kila, you're sticking your head outside of the kila. It's really just the kila is really like your dress, your cloak, your robe, and you're sticking your head outside of the kila. That would be okay. This is what Rav Tachlifa bar Ravimi says in the name of Shmuel, that you're sleeping in the kila, and you said Shema. You could say the Shema. You stick your head out, and you could say the Shema, and it's not a problem. The Gemara says, Meisvei, they asked a contradiction. Hayoshin b'kila arum lo yotzi reisha l'kila b'yikra kriyashma. A person can't do that, stick his head out and say Shema. So the Gemara answers, you know what? It's not a contradiction. Here, what are we talking about? You're not allowed to do it if it's 10 handbreadths tall, because then it's no longer your garment, similar to your garment. It's instead, that's like a separate entity. It's an entity of its own. And when you stick your head out, it's really your head it's nigrar after your body. It's pulled after your body, and we consider it as if your head is still inside the kila, because it's 10 handbreadths tall, and that would be a problem to say Shema, because you're not allowed to say a davar shebet kedusha, something of holiness. Ervas davar, which we're darshaning dibor, you can't have speech of a mitzvah inside in a place where there's nakedness. So that's the difference. The difference is if it's 10 handbreadths tall or not. If the kila is 10 handbreadths tall, then it's a problem to stick your head out. If it's not 10 handbreadths tall, then you can just stick your head out. Hachanami mistabra. This Gemara says this also makes sense. It's logical. Tani Seifa, since the end of the brisa says halam is a doime. What is this similar to? If a person is naked inside their house, that a person can't just stick their head outside the window and say, now I can say Shema, I'm outside, my head is outside the window. You can't do that. So why is that? Obviously, because in this scenario, the kila is more similar to a house than to a garment. In the other case, where it's less than 10 handbreadths, it's similar to a garment. But here, it's more than 10 handbreadths, it's more similar to a house. And the house is like a separate entity. And when you stick your head out, we're going to say that your head is really goes after your body, and it's considered like you're saying the Shema in front of nakedness. Shema Mina, the Gemara says, yes, sounds like a good proof. Shema Mina, we hear from this that's the answer.